Every generation faces a moment where it must decide whether democracy will be preserved as a living inheritance or abandoned as a forgotten story. Elections are more than campaigns, rallies, and ballots. They are the voice of the people. But history teaches us that this voice was not given freely. It was earned through the blood of those who dreamed of freedom, through the sweat of those who labored for justice, and through the tears of those who endured oppression. When we speak of elections, we must remember they are bound to sacrifices. This covenant is not written on paper alone. It is inscribed on the graves of martyrs, in the scars of activists, and in the broken chains of the oppressed. Our responsibility then is not merely to cast a vote, but to cast it with awareness, gratitude, and courage. To honor sacrifice is to value integrity, to reject corruption, and to ensure that our choices reflect a future of justice, equality, and hope. We must teach the next generation that the price of democracy is not just counted in currency or slogans, it is measured in lives given for the possibility of freedom. And so when you enter the polling station, you do not stand there alone. You stand on the shoulders of those who refuse to be silenced. You stand in a covenant sealed by sacrifice. Therefore, let us vote not with apathy, but with reverence. Let us engage not with fear, but with courage. And let us protect this covenant by living as citizens who understand that democracy is not a gift handed down. It is a responsibility handed over. The truest way to honor those sacrifices is to let our choices create the justice and peace for which they laid down their lives. This is the call of our time, to guard democracy, to respect sacrifice, and to keep the covenant alive. True democracy is never cheap. It is purchased with the sacrifices of those who stood, suffered, and gave their lives so that future generations could exercise the right to choose. When we speak about democracy and elections, we often think of campaign speeches, posters, rallies, and the quiet moment of casting a vote inside a polling station. But if we dig deeper into history, we discover that the very act of voting was not always as simple as putting a mark on a piece of paper. Behind this rite lies an ocean of sacrifices, a covenant written not with ink, but with blood, courage, and resilience. It is important to remember that democracy, in its purest sense, has always demanded a price. From the earliest struggles for representation to modern movements for civil rights, men and women across the world have paid with their lives to ensure that the voices of ordinary citizens are not silenced. Imagine for a moment the courage of those who stood in the face of monarchs, dictators, and oppressive systems, declaring that the people must have a say in their own future. They were met not with applause, but with persecution. Many were imprisoned, others exiled, and countless lives were lost. Yet from their struggle was born the fragile yet powerful institution we call democracy. The ballot is not merely a tool of choice, it is the inheritance of courage. Each time we vote, we participate in a process that has been defended by those who were willing to endure suffering so that freedom could reach our hands. This inheritance places a responsibility upon us that cannot be ignored. The sacrifices made for democracy remind us that the vote is sacred. In many nations, citizens once lived under systems where their opinions were meaningless, where laws were dictated by the few at the expense of the many. The right to vote, therefore, is not just a privilege, it is the fruit of battles fought and won. When we neglect this right, we not only waste an opportunity to shape the future, but also dishonor the sacrifices that made such freedom possible. That is why every election season is not just about candidates and parties. It is about honoring a covenant that links the ballot box to the blood of those who believed in liberty. Education plays a critical role in sustaining this covenant. A democracy cannot thrive on ignorance or apathy. It thrives only when citizens understand that their voices carry weight and that their choices have consequences. When people disengage, When they allow misinformation or indifference to rule, they weaken the very foundation built by sacrifice. That is why each generation must be reminded of the cost of their freedoms. In schools, in families, and in communities, the stories of sacrifice should be told, not to glorify suffering, but to ignite responsibility. The freedom to vote, to speak, and to participate must be understood as gifts handed down through generations, paid for with courage and conviction. Consider the movements in history where people risked everything to demand a say in governance. From revolutions that toppled oppressive empires to civil rights marches where peaceful protesters were beaten and jailed, each moment of struggle carries the same message: democracy is worth fighting for. These sacrifices were not abstract. They were deeply personal. Families lost fathers and mothers, communities lost leaders, and nations carried wounds. Yet these wounds birthed something greater, a chance for justice, representation, and equality. That is why we must never treat democracy as guaranteed. Without vigilance, without responsibility, without remembrance of sacrifice, democracy can wither. The covenant between elections and sacrifices calls us to a higher standard of citizenship. Casting a vote is not the end of responsibility, it is the beginning. It calls us to examine the integrity of those who seek office, to reject corruption, and to promote leaders who embody justice and accountability. If sacrifices were made to win the right to vote, then sacrifices must also be made to preserve the purity of democracy in our time. Sometimes those sacrifices are not of blood, but of comfort, time, and effort, choosing to be informed rather than entertained, choosing to participate rather than withdraw, choosing to speak truth when silence would be easier. In this way, every citizen becomes a guardian of the covenant. When we stand in line at a polling station, we do not stand there alone. We stand with the generations before us who could not vote but fought so that we could. We stand with the voices of those who declared that freedom must belong to all people, not just the privileged few. We stand with the martyrs whose lives were taken because they believed that ordinary men and women deserved a say in their own future. This awareness transforms the act of voting from a routine duty into a sacred responsibility. Each ballot becomes more than a choice for leadership. It becomes a reaffirmation of the covenant that binds elections to sacrifices. The weight of this covenant also challenges us to think beyond ourselves. Democracy is not simply about personal benefit. It is about the common good. When sacrifices were made for freedom, they were not made so that one individual could prosper at the expense of others. They were made for justice, for equality, for communities where dignity is upheld and opportunity is shared. That means when we vote, when we participate, we must do so with a vision larger than our own comfort. We must ask, will this choice honor the sacrifices of the past and build a just future for the next generation? It is easy to become cynical about politics, to see corruption, division, and dishonesty and conclude that nothing will ever change. But cynicism is a betrayal of sacrifice. If those who faced bullets and prisons did not give up on the hope of freedom, then how can we give up when faced with lesser challenges? Their courage demands our courage. Their endurance demands our persistence. To honor them, we must choose engagement over apathy, hope over despair, and action over resignation. As we move forward, we must guard against forgetting. History shows that when societies forget the price of freedom, they lose it. The covenant of elections and sacrifices must be remembered not just on election day, but every day. It must shape how we raise our children, how we build our institutions, how we hold our leaders accountable, and how we treat one another as citizens. Democracy is not perfect, but it is alive because sacrifices gave it breath. and it will remain alive only if we choose to honor that covenant with integrity, vigilance, and gratitude. So let us never forget, true democracy is never cheap. It comes at the highest cost, and because it was purchased with such a price, we must cherish it, protect it, and pass it forward. When we vote, when we speak, when we act with justice, we keep the covenant alive. And by keeping it alive, we not only honor those who came before us, but ensure that generations yet unborn will inherit the same sacred gift of freedom. The covenant between elections and sacrifices calls us to remember that our vote is not just a mark on paper. It is the fruit of blood, endurance, and courage, and it demands responsibility and integrity from every citizen. When we look at the process of elections, it may appear to be simple. We register, we go to a polling station, we cast a ballot, and the results are counted. But behind this simple process lies a story written with extraordinary sacrifice. Voting is not merely a technical process. It is a moral responsibility, one that binds the present generation to the struggles and victories of the past. To understand the weight of this covenant, we must first recognize that every right carries with it a duty, and every freedom comes at a cost. The right to vote was not freely handed to us. It was earned through decades and even centuries of resilience, where men and women gave up comfort, endured persecution, and in many cases gave their lives so that future citizens could stand freely and make choices about leadership and governance. Every time we step into a polling booth, we stand on sacred ground. We are not alone in that moment. With us are the echoes of voices that refuse to be silenced. With us are the memories of marchers who endured brutal beatings, of reformers who were imprisoned for daring to demand representation, of visionaries who spoke truth to power, knowing that truth could cost them everything. When we fail to recognize this, when we treat our vote as casual or insignificant, we dishonor those sacrifices and weaken the very fabric of democracy. A vote cast carelessly is not only a personal loss, it is a collective betrayal of courage. That is why elections cannot be approached as entertainment, as moments of passion without consequence. They must be approached with integrity, responsibility, and gratitude.
The covenant reminds us that a ballot is more than a choice for one candidate over another. It is a continuation of a struggle for dignity and justice. Every election carries within it the weight of history, the expectations of the present, and the possibilities of the future. When we make choices without integrity, when we allow corruption, prejudice, or selfish gain to guide us, we turn our backs on that covenant. But when we vote with awareness, when we study issues carefully, when we prioritize justice, equality, and the well-being of our communities, we uphold the sacrifices that secured this right. In this sense, every election is a test of our character as citizens. It is not just about who governs us, but about how we honor the legacy of those who paid the price for our freedom. Democracy is not sustained by ballots alone, but by the integrity of those who cast them. Integrity is more than honesty. It is the alignment of action with values. A citizen who understands the covenant of elections and sacrifices will not sell a vote for temporary gain, will not remain silent when corruption thrives, and will not disengage in apathy when the nation needs participation. Instead, such a citizen will rise to the challenge, recognizing that a single vote is part of a greater whole, a voice in a chorus that can direct the destiny of a people. When multiplied by millions, each act of responsibility can reshape the course of history. This is why apathy is dangerous. It silences voices that were once fought for, and it allows injustice to prevail without resistance.
The covenant calls us to refuse apathy and embrace responsibility. For democracy dies not only through oppression, but also through neglect. The endurance that built democracy must be mirrored in the endurance that sustains it. Our ancestors, reformers, and freedom fighters endured prisons, poverty, exile, and death too. Oh, secure what we now possess. Should we not endure a fraction of inconvenience to protect it? Should we not endure the effort of study, discussion, and critical thinking to ensure our choices are wise? Should we not endure the challenges of civic duty, speaking out, and holding leaders accountable, even when it is uncomfortable? The covenant of elections and sacrifices does not call for passive participation, but for active guardianship. It calls us to be more than voters. It calls us to be stewards of democracy, to ensure it remains untainted and vibrant for generations to come. Courage is the final thread woven into this covenant. It took courage for past generations to demand the right to vote, and it will take courage for us to preserve it. Courage is not always dramatic. Sometimes it looks like standing in long lines on election day, sometimes like resisting the temptation of corruption, sometimes like speaking unpopular truths when others prefer silence. Courage means defending the principles of justice even when they threaten our comfort. It means choosing leaders who may challenge us toward higher ideals rather than those who simply promise ease. The covenant requires courage because democracy is fragile and must be protected not only from enemies outside but also from weaknesses within. This covenant is not limited to nations or governments. It is deeply personal. Each citizen must decide whether they will honor or ignore it. Each ballot cast is either an act of remembrance and respect or an act of forgetfulness and disregard. The power rests not in institutions alone, but in the choices of ordinary people. That is both the beauty and the burden of democracy. It empowers us, but it also holds us accountable. If we desire societies of justice, equality, and hope, then we must build them not only through laws, but through the integrity of our votes and the courage of our participation. When we understand elections in this way, they cease to be routine events that happen every few years. They become sacred moments in the life of a nation, opportunities to renew a covenant made long before us. They remind us that the blood, endurance, and courage of those who came before us were not wasted but entrusted to us as a gift. And like every gift of great value, it must be protected, cherished, and passed forward. To vote with responsibility is to say to those who sacrificed, your struggle was not in vain. To vote with integrity is to tell the next generation, we will hand you not a broken system, but a living democracy. To vote with courage is to ensure that justice remains alive in the hearts of the people. Therefore, let us not forget that our vote is more than a mark on paper. It is the fruit of sacrifices that echo through history. It is the proof of endurance that withstood oppression. It is the reflection of courage that chose freedom over fear. The covenant of elections and sacrifices is alive today, waiting for us to embrace it with the same seriousness as those who forged it. May we live as citizens worthy of that covenant, casting every ballot with integrity, responsibility, and reverence, so that democracy remains not only a memory of the past, but a promise for the future. The covenant between democracy and sacrifice teaches us that the price of freedom is not just counted in currency or slogans. It is measured in lives given for the possibility of liberty, justice, and dignity. In every nation that values the right of the people to choose, there are chapters in its history written not in ink, but in blood. To understand democracy as simply a political process is to diminish its meaning. At its heart, democracy is the result of sacrifice, and to maintain it requires not only participation, but deep gratitude for those who gave everything so that others could live free. The ballot we cast today is the fruit of decades or centuries of struggle. It carries with it the weight of martyrs, the scars of protesters, the courage of reformers, and the faith of communities that endured suffering so that justice could become a living reality. When we study history, we find that freedom has always been purchased at a great cost. Revolutions, uprisings, reform movements, and civil disobedience have never been cheap. They have demanded the highest price, lives of men and women who believed that their suffering could open doors for others. Some were young students, some were seasoned leaders, some were mothers and fathers who dreamed of a better future for their children. They chose to stand against oppression, knowing that their stand might never benefit them directly, but it could benefit those who came after them. That is why democracy is not just a system of governance. It is a legacy of sacrifice, one that each generation inherits with responsibility. The true measure of that responsibility lies in how we treat the freedoms we enjoy. If sacrifices gave us the right to vote, to speak, and to participate, then to neglect these rights is to cheapen the price that was paid. Every act of apathy, every decision to remain silent in the face of corruption, careless or uninformed vote chips away at the dignity of those sacrifices. This is why remembering is so important. To honor sacrifice is to live as though those lives mattered, as though the struggles of the past still breathe in the present. Without remembrance, democracy becomes hollow, reduced to rituals without meaning. With remembrance, every action becomes sacred, every election a covenant renewed. This covenant challenges us to think beyond slogans and empty promises. A democracy built on sacrifice is not maintained by shallow words, but by deep integrity. Slogans can inspire temporarily, but they cannot build nations. Currency can fund campaigns, but it cannot purchase character. The real currency of democracy is courage, responsibility, and sacrifice. That is why we must reject the temptation to reduce politics to transactions. Democracy is not about buying and selling influence. It is about stewarding the cost of freedom with reverence. To forget this is to risk repeating history, to let authoritarianism or corruption steal what was bought with such a high price. Sacrifice also teaches us endurance. Freedom was not won overnight, nor will it be preserved without continuous effort. The generations who fought for it did not give up when doors were closed in their faces. They did not surrender when threatened, imprisoned, or exiled. They endured. That same endurance is required of us today. We may not face the same dangers, but we face apathy, disinformation, division, and corruption. These are enemies of democracy just as real as any dictator, because they weaken the soul of a nation from within. Endurance means continuing to believe in the power of justice even when progress seems slow. It means voting when you feel your voice does not matter, because your voice joins with millions of others to form a collective cry for change. It means staying engaged when taunts. The easier path is withdrawal. Lives given for democracy also remind us that freedom is not meant for the few, but for all. Sacrifice has always pointed toward a vision larger than self-interest. This covenant must also be passed to the next generation. If young people grow up disconnected from the stories of sacrifice, they may inherit democracy but not understand its value. They may think of voting as optional, of justice as negotiable, of freedom as permanent. But if we teach them the cost, if we tell the stories of courage, if we show them the graves of martyrs and the records of reformers, then they will understand. They will see that democracy is fragile and precious, that it requires their participation, and that their voice carries the legacy of countless sacrifices. This is the responsibility of families, educators, and leaders to ensure that the covenant of democracy and sacrifice is not forgotten but handed down as a living truth. Therefore, the true price of democracy is never counted in money or slogans. It is counted in the lives given for its possibility. And that price demands that we live differently. It demands that we vote with wisdom, speak with integrity, act with courage, and remember with gratitude. It demands that we never trivialize what was purchased with such a cost. Our responsibility is clear: to ensure that those sacrifices were not in vain, to protect what was handed down, and to pass forward a democracy that is alive, vibrant, and just. This is the covenant we inherit, the covenant we must keep, the covenant that transforms every election into a sacred act of remembrance and responsibility.